Today we're going to look at fiscal policy and see how fiscal policy is used to manage the economy. Remember, fiscal policy is a demand-side policy, which means that it attempts to shift or change the amount of aggregate demand in a country. Always, of course, when you think aggregate demand, you need to think of C plus I plus G plus X minus N. So, in particular here, the goal of fiscal policy is to change the size of the circular flow by changing the size of G, government spending, and or the size of taxation that leaves. Remember, G is an injection and T, taxation, is a leakage. So if the injection is larger than the leakage, the circular flow grows. But if the leakage is larger than the injection, the circular flow will then shrink. It's important to note that tax revenue does not have to equal government spending. And it's fair to say that it probably never does equal government spending. That is, the amount of tax that a government brings in is rarely going to be matched perfectly by the amount of spending that they do in that same year. In fact, for most governments, if they're within a few $1 million, they consider themselves balanced, but even then, that rarely happens. Fiscal policy, remember, is always going to be countercyclical, which is to say that if the economy is in a contraction, then the government's going to try to make it expand. So expansion is countercyclical to the contraction. If an inflation is occurring, remember, we don't think an expansion is bad, but expansions always go hand in hand with inflation. So if inflation is our worry, then we're going to try to slow down the economy via contractionary policy. What that means is that during an expansion, G is going to be greater than T. That is, the injection is going to be greater than the leakage, so it's going to help the circular flow to grow. And then vice versa with an inflation, we're going to try to shrink the circular flow a little bit because G, government spending, so the amount of revenue they take in, will be greater than the amount of spending they do. So tax is the revenue. By the way, we're going to talk more specifically about the sources of revenue and spending in the very next video, so keep an eye out for that when you see it. The goal of a countercyclical policy is to smooth out the business cycle. It's not to make the business cycle, perfectly go up and down the line of best fit or the line of potential. That's not really realistic. But you want to make the expansions a little bit less steep. Therefore, the contractions will be a little bit less severe. That's the goal of these policies. Okay, how it works is pretty simple. Obviously, if we can increase aggregate demand, what we're going to see is that Y1 is going to go to Y2. So we're going to see more economic activity, more employment. The circular flow is growing at the unfortunate cost of prices also going up. A future video, probably second or third from now, is going to talk about how this is going to look different in the Keynesian or neoclassical view. But no matter what we care about, this would be expansionary policy where the government is trying to protect against contraction, therefore it's trying to make economic activity, national income, increase. The opposite of that would be contractionary policy, and you might think that just turning this around would be exactly what it's going to look like. That's certainly one way to see it, so we could just decrease the amount of government spending, therefore decrease aggregate demand, therefore reduce the amount of economic activity, but that tends to be a pretty hard thing for the government to want to do. Remember, economic activity, Y, is jobs. Y is people being happy, businesses getting more orders, able to employ more people. So, it's unlikely that the government's going to actively seek to reduce that. It's more likely that we're going to see something like what I have shown here. Remember, if inflation is a problem, it's because there's a lot of consumption. It's because there's a lot of business spending, I. So, what the government tries to do is not to make the growth go away, but they just try to slow it down. So what I have diagrammed here is I have AD1, and let's say that with government keeping the same amount of spending they had, that the shift in aggregate demand because of changes to consumption and investment, just because the economy is growing, just because the circular flow is expanding on its own, let's say it would have shifted all the way to 82. Well, the government's going to say, all right, we see that the economy is healthy, so we're going to pull back a little bit. So we're going to spend a little bit less, so this is aggregate demand minus G, so G is going to decrease. So instead of shifting all the way to 82, they're going to only shift to AD minus G. Well, we still have a good effect. National income is going to go from Y1 to YG, so that's shown by arrow A. And sure, people might be upset that the full shift of Y1 to Y2, arrow B, they might be upset that that didn't occur, but it's pretty hard to actually quantify. Here the government can say, look, the economy's growing, there's this much more employment, revenue's up this much in various businesses, etc., etc. The other good effect is that instead of price going all the way to PL2, price level is only going to increase by a smaller amount, PL1 to PLG. And that's really, remember, the problem that the government is protecting against is inflation, so that's their number one goal. If you have any questions, go ahead and post a comment down below, and look out for future videos.